Gentlemen, welcome to the Hancock Lecture for 2024. I'm Stephen Gardner, I'm the President of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. And before we begin proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the land has never been ceded and that their custodianship and care for country is an ethos of great value for the nation going forward. It's wonderful to be able to host this year's Hancock Lecture. It's part of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Symposium. It comes out of that particular event, and it's great to welcome our colleagues from CAS here. We've had a wonderful day of interchange and elaboration of key ideas around the idea of population and culture in nation building. And we welcome Professor Yu and all of his colleagues from CAS here today. Also, this event has been generously supported by the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, and we're very grateful for their support. And Simon Smith from the Foundation is here. Lovely to welcome Simon. We're also joined this evening by past President Emeritus Professor John Fitzgerald and the Academy Editor Emeritus Professor Louise Edwards, both amongst the nation's leading experts on China. And I also want to acknowledge and thank our International Secretary, Emeritus Professor Joe Lo Bianco, who's also a past president of the Academy, who is one, if not the foremost, language and linguistics policy expert in Australia, for convening the symposium that we've been having all day. So Joe, thank you for all of your work getting that symposium together. Much appreciated. Well, the Hancock Lecture is named after Sir William Keith Hancock, or better known as Sir Keith Hancock, first president of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and a very distinguished historian of the British Empire, and held chairs at Adelaide, Birmingham, Oxford, University of London, before coming back to the ANU and playing a key role in many of the key humanities and social science institutions of Australia, including the Australian Academy of the Humanities. And this lecture, to commemorate his work, invites outstanding early career scholars to present their work publicly, and it's been held every year since 1993. This year, our lecturer is Dr Nathan Gardner, a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Melbourne. Nathan's currently part of an ARC discovery project, working with Professor Susan Kneebone to produce a comprehensive history of community sponsorship initiatives for refugee resettlement in Australia. And the Academy Council were very impressed by Nathan's work, by his track record, by the project that he's working on, and generally his work overall. He's a historian of forced migration, diasporas and multiculturalism in Australia. And he interestingly uses oral history interviews and community-produced or non-English language materials to inform studies of Australia's diverse communities. And he has a forthcoming monograph, In the Face of Diversity, A History of Chinese Australian Community Organisations from 1970 to 2020, which examines the political actions of community organisations and their expressions of community unity in response to significant local and international developments. Really interesting and exciting work. And in tonight's lecture, Nathan will consider the topic, what makes a multicultural nation? The contribution of Chinese Australian communities. Please welcome Dr. Nathan Gardner.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Professor Garton. I'm immensely grateful to the Australian Academy of the Humanities for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. In particular, I'd like to thank Executive Director Inga Davis for inviting me to speak here, and Sophie Chessel for all the organisations that she's done behind the scenes. and also to Professor Joe Lebianco for discussing some early ideas for this lecture. As mentioned tonight, I'll be discussing topics of multiculturalism and migration. However, it's necessary for us to all appreciate that Australia's multicultural and migration experiences have developed out of the colonisation of stolen lands. And I also want to acknowledge that this evening we are meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people, and also acknowledge that the work I share with you tonight was done on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I want to extend my respect to those peoples and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today, as well as my support for movements of truth, treaty and sovereignty, because this always was, always will be Aboriginal land. With this acknowledgement of country still on our minds, I want us to think about what makes a multicultural nation. Considering the extent to which multiculturalism is being unmade by ethno-nationalist and populist politics in democracies around the world today, I think this is an important question. To begin our journey tonight, I want to open with a quote from the late Sabin Chen. For those who didn't know him, in 1999, he became the first Chinese-born federal parliamentarian in Australia. One day in August 2018, I spent an afternoon talking with him in Melbourne's Chinatown. It was in one of the old clubhouses that still stand behind the ever-changing shop frontages of Little Bourke Street. I was there to interview him, but as sometimes happens in the process of making oral history, the exchange of questions and ideas was already flowing before I could get the tape rolling. So as we sat down at an old, long wooden table in the clubhouse, I asked Chen to briefly describe again what multiculturalism meant to him. And I'll just read out his quote here. Well, for a lot of people, multiculturalism seems to be implied as an end product. We will finish with a multicultural Australia. But to me, it has never been actually the right approach to it. Even though at the beginning, there's a lot of people that did believe that, even today, a lot of people still assume that when we talk about multicultural Australia, it just means that big mixing bowl. But in the Australian multiculturalism, we emphasise the process of respecting the contribution of each component of that population, from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different heritages, who can make a contribution to the development of an Australian culture. And importantly, that's a process, not an end product. I'm really grateful to Tsobin's daughter, Jacinta Chen, and the rest of the family for letting me begin my lecture with that excerpt, because for me, it was a formative conversation. It made me think about multiculturalism as a process rather than a product, as an unending journey for a nation rather than a final destination, and ideally, as a mode of collective participation rather than a divisionary tool or a tokenistic gesture. To help show you what I mean, I want to look at some of the historic examples set by Chinese Australian communities, which I think exemplify multiculturalism as a democratic practice. Of course, these historical examples of multiculturalism practice occurred neither in a vacuum nor in a simple binary configuration between an ethnic minority and an ethnic majority, that being Anglo-Australians. In reality, there were a mess of intra- and inter-ethnic interactions taking place, coming in an array of configurations across multiple periods and intersecting interests. So in an effort to more evocatively demonstrate the intricacies of doing multiculturalism, I'll go through some sites of overlap between Chinese Australian and other ethnic minority communities of Australia. While I'm up here and I have your attention for the next 45 minutes or so, or at least I hope I maintain your attention, I finally want to offer some reflections on how historians and other humanitarian scholars fit into this practice of doing multiculturalism in Australia. Multiculturalism, I think, is one of those words we all seem to use without thinking, or it's something that we're able to recognise when we see it, yet we find it difficult to define, especially in a way that's agreeable with others. This is likely due to each of us having a different thing in mind when we think about multiculturalism. To some, multiculturalism refers primarily to a distinct set of policies and ideology of cultural pluralism that first emerged in Canada before a local vanguard of ethnic rights activists, academics and policymakers created an Australian version in the 1970s. To others, multiculturalism is thought of mainly in terms of social and cultural attitudes, as the acceptance of Australia's demographic reality or the country's final destination after moving through stages of racial exclusion, assimilationism, and integrationism. As a nation-building tool, multiculturalism has been attacked by those on the right as a means to divide Australia into a nation of many tribes, as people might recognise the quote, while those on the left have charged it as tokenism at best, or at worst, a means to entrench Anglo-Australian hegemony. Whatever it is, multiculturalism is generally seen to have been in peril ever since the Howard years, withering under the rhetoric of the war on terror, of boat arrivals, of foreign interference, and now it seems the cost of living. Although we often hear that Australia is, quote, one of the most successful multicultural countries in the world, the statement rings like an ironic cliché, where once we had a dedicated department supported by an army of experts and agencies, multicultural affairs, along with immigration, is now treated as something to be policed by the country's domestic security apparatus, the Department of Home Affairs. Despite these fraught visions of modern multiculturalism, there remains an optimism about the purpose, potential, and practice of multiculturalism in Australia's everyday reality. This optimism provides the thrust for the recently released report of the Multicultural Framework Review titled Towards Fairness. After travelling the length and breadth of Australia for 6 months, the creators of the review, Dr Bulent Dalal, Nyadol Nguyen, and Christine Castley, discovered that what they called a lasting truth about multiculturalism. And again, I'll read this quote. My emphasis here: Australian communities are the driving force behind the success and resilience of multiculturalism. From remote rural areas to bustling cities, Australians from diverse backgrounds have upheld the essence of multiculturalism, despite changes in government focus and priorities. Though they might not explicitly articulate it in this way, they have embraced an attitude of acceptance and tolerance, demonstrating that multiculturalism is not just a social policy, but a lived experience. Their acceptance, understanding, and willingness to embrace diversity have shaped the success and resilience of multiculturalism in Australia. This is a type of multiculturalism, I argue, Chinese Australian communities have historically displayed. Beyond a set of policies that change according to government agendas, for these communities, multiculturalism is a reality lived, experienced, and practiced in forms that range from the prosaic to the highly political. Importantly, the review panel for Towards Fairness also described the essence of multiculturalism: attitudes of resilience, acceptance, understanding, and embracing diversity. Such attitudes are recognisable in the historical actions of Chinese Australian communities both before and after the advent of multiculturalism, and help us to see how and why communities became the driving force of multiculturalism. So I'll get to the history now. I don't think there's any agreeable birthday for multicultural Australia, but somewhere in the 1970s, between the Whitlam government's removal of the last piece of the White Australia policy and the Fraser government's wholesale endorsement of the Galbally report, multiculturalism emerged as a new set of principles by which Australia could guide itself. However, to lift from one of Australia's cultural touchstones, the castle, and everyone's favourite constitutional lawyer, Dennis Denuto, multiculturalism was also a vibe. After the pall of the White Australia policy was lifted, many of Australia's ethnic minority communities expressed fresh confidence in their identities and belonging in Australia, and an optimism for the future. The formations and social participation of ethnic communities and organisations showed how this multicultural vibe was translated into multicultural practice. In this regard, I think Chinese Australian communities and organisations are the example par excellence. So, here we have a table showing the number of Chinese Australian community organisations that were registered in the Ethnic Directory of Communities, which was kind of like a phone book of sorts for ethnic communities in Australia that was produced by the Department of Immigration through, I think, the Australian Multicultural Affairs Office. What I'd like to point out here on this table is, in just over a decade, the number of Chinese Australian community organisations that were registered in the directory more than quadrupled. And I should also point out here that this isn't all the organisations that were in existence, just those that wish to be listed. From it, we get a sense of how far and how quickly such communities and organisations were extending their presence in Australian society. These organisations began creating language schools, libraries, childcare and aged care services. They were hosting movie nights, bushwalks, picnics and gala evenings. At public events, they were putting on cooking displays, music, lion dancing. I always say line dancing, but I mean lion dancing, and dragon boat races. So after a long absence from Australian public life in the 1970s and this multicultural turn, we see ushered in a kind of renaissance for Chinese Australian communities. We have old organisations being revitalised, including Melbourne Siyup Society, which was formed in 1854 by Chinese from the Four Counties area in Guangdong province, and the Chunghwa Association in Perth, which was formed in 1909 by a mixture of ethnic Chinese, mainly from the Strait settlements, which we now know as Singapore and Malaysia. Fresh waves of migration also led to the creation of new organisations. The Chinese Association of South Australia was formed in Adelaide in 1971 by a mixture of university students, young professionals and families, mainly from Malaysia and Hong Kong. And the Chinese Fellowship of Victoria, which was formed in the same year, had a mixed membership of young and old, white and blue-collar Chinese migrants, predominantly from the mainland. The formation of Sydney's Australian Chinese Community Association, or ACCA, itself seemed to be an expression of the hope and optimism of this new multicultural atmosphere. ACCA's founding premise was to bring together the many and various communities in Sydney at the time. And for anyone who's familiar with Chinese Australian communities, we know how far back and how deeply some of these divisions can go. So what the groups they're trying to bring together included the long-established and locally born Chinese Australians, Sydney-siders, young and ambitious recent migrants from Hong Kong and Southeast Asia, and as years went on, ethnic Chinese who escaped the wars and political upheavals of Indochina. When 350 people gathered at ACCA's inaugural meeting, which we see photographed here, on the 7th of July 1974, high hopes and jubilation for the future mixed with lingering feelings that, quote, the community was far too divided by suspicion and interests ever to unite into one association. To ameliorate their differences, the leaders of this initiative hammered out a constitution that made ACCA distinctly non-political, non-religious, and non-sectarian. They would promote acceptance of each other's differences and focus only on matters that pertain to their common cultural and migrant experiences. These organisations' different compositions, histories, and locations are demonstrative of the diversity of Chinese Australian communities, even at the early stages of multiculturalism. These different backgrounds influenced the different ways that these organisations engaged with the emerging concept of multiculturalism. For example, in the different ways that inter-ethnic relations were pursued and made to work on their own terms. For the erudite and urbane Chinese Association of South Australia, inviting a minister or a state premier to a dinner function as their guest of honour was an opportunity to advocate, for example, for Mandarin to be taught at the tertiary level in South Australian universities, which were and still are, or to gain commitments to check the spread and influence of racist organisations in the state, which during the 70s and early 80s was also more spreading. In Sydney, the Australian Chinese Community Association's formation was a direct response to multicultural policy, that being the 1973 National Population Inquiry, which canvassed public opinion on matters about the country's future demographic composition. In its own submission, the preliminary ACCA steering committee suggested the government accept more Chinese migrants. In making its case, it argued that Chinese had long been migrants to Australia, that they already had established communities, making integration into Australian society easy, and also pointedly added that encouraging Chinese migration would right the historic wrong done by the White Australia policy. Other organisations took more defensive positions against multiculturalism from above. In 1975, the Chinese Fellowship of Victoria publicly campaigned against the City Council and state government's $500,000 proposal to revamp Melbourne's Chinatown with Chinese-style gates, lamps, and other decorations. Launching a letter campaign among the local residents and business owners, CFV argued such a makeover would only exoticize and alienate Chinese Australians from the broader community to which they claimed to belong. Likewise, in Sydney, ACCA demanded that the government's proposed redevelopment of Dixon Street and the nearby Darling Harbour Gardens adhere to the wishes of the local Chinese Australian community. That being to have not just a pretty place, but a practical place where the community could come together and function. In both cases, the government projects only went ahead after gaining community support. In Melbourne, this was by way of local community leaders forming a Chinatown Governing Committee, which could have some say and control over the character of the Chinatown precinct. I point out that this committee was formed 10 years later, and that's how long it took to kind of hammer out an agreement. In Sydney, ACCA conducted surveys and held consultations with Dixon Street locals and used them to support their submissions to various planning authorities. Eventually, amid growing public interest, these authorities had to concede to the wishes of locals. After the opening of the Chinese Gardens in Darling Harbour, ACCA attributed success to the outspokenness of people from our community. Chalking it up as a victory for multiculturalism, ACCA declared, quote, "It was proud to offer our excellent heritage to the country and let our culture beam with Australia's development." I think we can take ACCA's positivity here at face value because, like other organisations at the time, its newsletters, public engagements and government submissions were filled with a desire to participate in Australia's multicultural society. ACCA encouraged its members to take an intense interest in the social and political matters and well-being of this country. Let us enjoy the privileges and fulfil the obligations. Let us work together to make this country an even better place to live in, and as you can see in capital letters, come on Australians. Of course, the positivity was tempered with memories of the past. Nevertheless, community organisations that could remember Australia when it was not so welcoming still recognised that it was time to step forward and reassert a presence. Responding to this, an editorial in the newsletter of Perth's Chunghwa Association advised, many of us have insulated ourselves from active community services and have built up an apathy in our attitudes. It is time that we come out of this retreat and be more active and constructive in the society in which we live. After long histories of social marginalisation and community organisations now saw themselves as purposefully occupying a more integral position in Australian society. However, these long histories of marginalisation also explain how and why Chinese Australian communities were ready to take up the promises of multicultural policy and put them into practice. So, since establishing themselves in the various 19th century colonies that would become Australia, Chinese settlers had been building resilient communities, maintaining diverse identities, and pushing for mutual social acceptance and living cultural pluralism. In the post-war period, the very presence of Chinese peoples posed a challenge to the White Australia policy. Some better-known examples include local campaigns to prevent the deportation of Chinese sailors who came to Australia as wartime refugees, or the arrival of ethnic Chinese students under programs like the Colombo Plan. These groups of students and sailors might, at first glance, seem somewhat disparate, but their presence and experiences overlap in the social spaces that they shared. Such spaces included the Maoist sections of Australia's union movement, like we see here, the Seamen's Union of Australia. But I'm going to thank Antonia very much for these photos. While I was doing my PhD, I remember my supervisor, Antonia Finane, telling me about her time as a university student at Sydney University and through a local community organisation called the Chinese Youth League, met Chinese students and sailors at social functions as well. The overlap of these groups also extended into spheres of white Australia. An editorial quip that was widely syndicated in tabloid newspapers in 1949 exclaimed, "Talk about inconsistency. The federal government is deporting those wretched Chinese sailors with tactless enthusiasm. At the same time, it's bringing in Asiatics for free education at our universities and paying them an allowance 3 times higher than the rehab allowance to our ex-servicemen. And sorry, that was a belated language warning I should give, that there's going to be some offensive language in here, but please bear with me. The conflation of Chinese sailors, Asiatic students, and Australian Anglo ex-servicemen is a good reminder to appreciate the complexities of the peoples and periods we study, and to see the forest and the trees at the same time. Therefore, when we are studying the various communities of multicultural Australia, we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently perpetuate ethnic segregation or categorisations that might stifle our understandings of Australian society. Another good example are these pictures. Does anyone recognise these pictures? I saw John nod, but I think I'll leave John off the hook. These pictures capture the contributions made by local Chinese residents to celebrate the Duke of York's visit to Melbourne to open Australia's first parliament in the first week of May in 1901. While the dragon belonged to the See Up Society, the banners and decorations of the arch indicate that this projection of the Chinese community was a joint effort of the See Up Society and the Kongchu Society. Welcomed by the Chinese citizens, the arch reads, "Lanterns decorated with blessings for the Duke and for Australia were festooned along the towers." However, as anti-Chinese sentiment and keeping Australia for the white man had been central planks for Australia's federation, many people have looked at these images and thought, what on earth did the Chinese have to celebrate? How scorned these revellers must have felt when one of the first acts of this new parliament was to restrict Asian immigration. John Fitzgerald has thought deeply on the Chinese involvement in this celebration. Drawing especially on the Chinese language newspapers of the time, Fitzgerald underlined how the Chinese contribution to the celebration reflected the local interests of the community, ideas of modern citizenship and imperial subjecthood, as well as the relations between the Chinese and British empires. What the Chinese achieved in this moment was not as important as what they envisioned, he suggests. And John, forgive me, but I'm going to read a quote from you here. The Chinese-Australian vision at Federation was one of a nation in which all people, whoever they were, counted as equals. Their vision was rooted in a sense of natural justice and fairness, the ideal of a fair go, rather than merely in laws or in formal protocols and treaties. In imagining the future of this nation, Chinese Australians were among the most astute of our sentimental dreamers. It is, after all, their dream of a multiracial Australia that we are invited to share today, to share as Australians now. So what I believe John is pointing us towards here are the seeds of something that could blossom into a vibrant multicultural society decades later. But even at Federation, Australia already was, in fact, multiracial. So did anyone else belong to what Fitzgerald was calling this community of dreamers? Well, alongside the Chinese Australians, another ethnic minority was involved in the Duke of York celebrations, the largest non-British, non-Indigenous ethnic group at the time, German Australians. Like their Chinese counterparts, the German residents physically expressed their optimism and belonging in the future of the new nation with the construction of a triumphal arch. And like their Chinese counterparts, the German residents' contribution was spearheaded by their own ethnic community organisations, namely the Tivoli Club and the Deutsche Turnverein, which still exist today as well, and next month we'll be putting on Oktoberfest celebrations. Emblazoned on their arch were the words, "The German citizens greet the Commonwealth," and "Peace and goodwill to united Australia." A tableau by Peter Hansen, who was trained at the Royal Academy of Munich, depicted Germany as an angel of peace crowning 6 federated Australian sisters with oral wreaths. Hansen also reproduced the personifications of peace and war. We can actually barely see them here on the banner. And these representations stand at the Niederwald Monument, which itself is dedicated to the Federation of Germany in 1870. Both the Chinese and the German-Australian contributions expressed their cultural identities in a way that made them distinct, yet no less part of this new Australia. As the Duke and Duchess of York travelled around the rest of Australia, the extent to which German and Chinese Australian communities across the new country partook in further celebrations was, I think, remarkable. In Sydney and Brisbane, representatives of the German and Chinese communities each addressed the royal couple and offered their welcome and faithfulness as British subjects. The German Liedertafel in Adelaide held a 600-strong torchlit procession that ended in a choral performance for the Duke, while Chinese communities in Ballarat and Perth also built triumphal arches for the Duke. And I'll also point out that the German community in Sydney built a triumphal arch for the Federation celebrations in Sydney in January 1901. The two communities' ability and will to partake in so many celebrations across Australia, I think, is testament to their comparable size and their distribution, as well as the places they occupied in the colonial and Federation-era Australia. Indeed, graphs showing the sizes of Germany and China-born populations in Australia show some remarkable symmetries, namely the male populations here, but we can see overall some similarity in the general trajectories of those populations. When looked at alone, the decrease in the Chinese population could be easily attributed to the White Australia policy, as I have done in my research. However, looking at the graph in tandem with the decrease in the German population throws up some interesting questions about other push or pull factors that might have been working across both communities. Alongside the established notion that Australia was pushing out Chinese under the White Australia policy, which it certainly was, the downward trajectories of both populations might make us reconsider Australia's actual ability to attract people from overseas to settle here permanently. Moreover, the rate of decline of Germany-born persons suggests that the sojourner phenomenon in Australia may not have singularly been a Chinese one. When thinking about how different ethnic communities have been separately studied to reveal truths about Australian history or society, I'm reminded of the Chinese saying, 种盲摸象. Some of us might know this as the parable of the blind man and the elephant. In this story, each man touches a different part of the animal, and each says that an elephant is like a snake, a spear, a wall, a rope, a fan, or a tree. I'm not saying that the blind men are foolish by any means, not least because of my own research. I believe I've been like them. Each person is making an astute observation of the part that they are inspecting. However, a multicultural nation, by definition, has multiple parts, and what makes inter-ethnic comparisons important. This is what makes inter-ethnic comparisons important. If we are to understand what makes a multicultural nation, we must know how the parts work together and how together they make a whole. So, the overlap of experience and interests of different communities is especially salient when multiculturalism comes under attack. Often, these attacks begin by targeting a specific community or a specific issue before growing to encompass others. Perhaps the most prominent example in recent decades came in the late 1990s when Pauline Hanson and One Nation took populist politics and xenophobia to heights not seen for at least a generation. In her infamous maiden speech, Hanson claimed that Australia was being, quote, swamped by Asians, and welfare for Aboriginals was some kind of reverse racism that needed to be stopped. Using her political platform, she staged attacks on multiculturalism, called for a retreat to Australia's Anglo-Australian past. The reach of her message was extended by uncritical media coverage and an undiscerning and I should say also Prime Minister Howard's personal disdain for what he called political correctness and his undiscerning support for free speech. However, the attacks also had the effect of galvanising popular opposition. As Sean Sculmer has argued in his own writing about the Hanson period, the seriousness of the threat and the size of the opposition to Hansonism have a commensurate relationship. As we can see, a chorus of opposition came from Chinese Australian communities and organisations around the country. The period was abuzz with letter-writing campaigns and media appearances. I remember a finding a survey of more than 1,000 Chinese Australians from across the country, which was sent to John Howard as proof of what he had denied, which was the fact that racial abuse and assault had increased markedly since Hanson's maiden speech. As we can see in these images here, people from all walks of life were literally walking together to oppose the division Hanson spruiked. So we've got these two images here, which I've stitched together, which are actually from Hyde Park, just behind us. It was a powerful demonstration of the place multicultural ideals had now taken in Australian society. From the threat emerged opportunities to open new lines of inter-ethnic communication and undertake a more critical approach to multiculturalism. At the forefront of this was the Chinese Australian Forum, an organisation aimed at improving the engagement of Chinese Australians with Australian society and politics. In the wake of the Hanson years and a failed referendum on Australia becoming a republic, the CAF nevertheless remained committed to building a better society through the cooperation of all of Australia's many ethnic communities. In October 2000, it hosted a seminar for Aboriginal and Chinese Australians to work together on what they called a strategy for the inclusion of non-Indigenous ethnic communities in reconciliation. Discussants identified prejudice and language as two prevailing barriers to freer dialogue between the communities. Participants also acknowledged that the practice of multiculturalism itself would have to be changed if reconciliation between Indigenous and settler communities was to improve. Scholar and multiculturalism advocate Laksari Jayasuriya pointedly noted that, and to quote him here, the Aboriginal people have, rightly, been lukewarm and indifferent to the cultural ideology of Australian multiculturalism, which has been framed specifically to cater to the needs and aspirations of immigrant settlers. At the same time, immigrant ethnic groups, until very recently, have failed to recognise and acknowledge the special status of Aboriginal people and to promote their concerns. Australia could be described as two societies, one multicultural, the other racist. As a result, the agenda of the reconciliation process has had little or no impact on the non-Indigenous ethnic minorities. Furthermore, present multiculturalism masks the exclusion and oppression of Aboriginal Australians. Jayasuriya's words are another reminder of why we must critically engage with the clichés of Australia being the most successful multicultural nation. Following the result of last year's Voice referendum, I think we can see how potent the politics of division can be. We should heed it as a warning sign that something is wrong with the way Australia is doing multiculturalism right now. So in another example today, within the present debate about China's influence in Australian politics and society, academics and authors, intentionally or not, are undoing multiculturalism by way of essentialism. Journalist Peter Harcher warned readers of his latest book, Red Zone, that Australia was, quote, Australia has built a Chinese community of 1.3 million without really understanding it or its consequences. And I'll repeat that. Australia has built a Chinese community of 1.3 million without really understanding it or its consequences. Harcher points out this dubious and monolithic Chinese community now in Australia, not to demystify it, but to reveal the naivety of Australians, namely non-Chinese Australians. In Silent Invasion, Clive Hamilton goes further and closes his book with guesses at the percentages of Chinese Australians loyal to China before Australia. And I'll read out his quote here. Remembering that there are over 1 million people of Chinese heritage in Australia, we could expect some, citizens and non-citizens alike, to take to the streets to express their loyalty to Beijing, in other words, to Australia's enemy. This could create ongoing and potentially severe civil strife, unrest that would be orchestrated by the Chinese embassy in Canberra. The prospect of civil discord is not mere speculation. And I'll leave that inflammatory comment to stand for a minute. because it's something I think we should seriously engage with. It is worrying to consider how this logic might lead to indiscriminate harms towards Chinese Australians, like the spike in racist violence and abuse towards Chinese Australians and other Australians of East Asian backgrounds that we saw during the COVID pandemic. It is unfortunate, but Hamilton accepts that loyal Chinese Australians, quote, may have to take some collateral damage to win the larger battle against what he calls the PRC's political interference in Australia. While Hamilton might be right to be vigilant about the PRC's political influence in Australia, scholars must ensure that collateral damage is not inflicted indiscriminately upon any Australians, rather than accept it as the price of our work. Irrespective of their ethnic backgrounds, scholars, writers, and artists have a special place in multicultural Australia. What we say and do matters. We are, in fact, a community, and we often refer to ourselves as such, especially within the university context. I know at Melbourne University, we often refer to ourselves as a community. If we are indeed another community in multicultural Australia, how then should we do multiculturalism? Today we have no shortage of issues to engage with and no shortage of examples from other Australian communities taking action. But again, we can look towards Chinese Australians and their transnational connections. So if we think of scholarly communities as a transnational one, I think if we look towards our transnational community of scholars, what is presently happening in Gaza is as salient as it is urgent. In April of this year, the UN reported that 5,479 students had been killed, as had 261 teachers and 95 professors, and that 80% of schools had been destroyed or damaged. These figures, I regret, are now higher. The Israeli military has razed the central archives in Gaza, and in January it demolished the territory's last standing university. The report coined the term scholasticide to describe the violence specifically. When schools are destroyed, so too are hopes and dreams. These attacks are not isolated incidents, the report said. They went on to say they present a systematic pattern of violence aimed at dismantling the very foundation of Palestinian society. So how should our community of scholars react to scholasticide? In this regard, I think we can look towards Chinese Australian communities for an example. In June 1989, when news reached Australia of the People's Liberation Army killing students and their supporters in Beijing, Chinese Australian communities responded viscerally and immediately. They commonly used words like da tu sha and san sha to describe what had happened, which respectively translate as massacre or to massacre. Even the Chinese Fellowship of Victoria, which had hitherto been a stalwart supporter of the PRC, announced its 愤怒谴责,神痛哀悼, which I translate as furious condemnation and bitter grief. Over the image of 5 wreaths, it declared on the front page of its newsletter, we strongly condemn the brutality of the PLA, who cold-bloodedly murdered our defenceless patriotic compatriots. It is difficult to convey the shock and despair that permeated the newsletters and public announcements of many community organisations at this time. On the 27th of May, just a week before the massacre, the CFV, together with 12 other organisations, published a statement in support of the protests that had been happening in China for a month. Their statement declared the organisations shared belief that the protests were patriotic movements and urged the Chinese government not to use force against demonstrators and underscored the right of the Chinese people to protest for greater democracy, transparency, and government accountability. The statement had been forwarded to allies in Hong Kong and authorities in mainland China as an expression of, quote, the common view of overseas Chinese communities. When the tragedy did strike, many communities rallied to aid the Chinese students who were here in Australia with moral and material support. Community organisations lobbied on the students' behalf. On the 16th of June 1989, community leaders from each state and territory jointly met with Prime Minister Bob Hawke in Canberra to discuss the welfare of Chinese students. According to President James Lee of the Australian Chinese Forum, Hawke welcomed their suggestions. How much so was revealed when Hawke held a televised conference later that afternoon. He began by acknowledging that his meeting with representatives of Chinese Australian communities had provided an opportunity to, quote, announce a range of important new government initiatives. He declared, among other things, extensions to the students' visas and increases in their access to welfare. As has become clear in the later accounts of this event, the extent of the measures came as a surprise to Hawke's colleagues and staffers. James Lee, however, recognised that what Hawke announced was a close match to what the community leaders had jointly suggested to him that morning. For a moment, those community leaders had had the ear of the Prime Minister and used the opportunity for the benefit of Chinese students in Australia. Today, when I think of our community of scholars and where we can start doing multiculturalism, I think we can start by standing with our students who have been peacefully protesting at our institution's complicity in the violence in Gaza. At the University of Melbourne, I was heartened to see so many humanities students standing alongside students from other disciplines, standing against violence and calling for peace. The encampment made by students were spaces of inter-ethnic and inter-religious solidarity. Students from Muslim, Jewish, and a wide range of ethnic backgrounds camped together. They held teach-ins and shared aspects of their cultural identities. They held Shabbat, they held the call to prayer together. They showed mutual respect and understanding, and when they came under attack from outside forces, which they frequently did, both verbal and physical, they repeatedly responded with tolerance and restraint. From different backgrounds, they came together over a shared humanity. Collectively, they were contributing to Australian politics and society in a multicultural way. So, to close, I want to return to the question that I posed in the title and at the beginning of this lecture, where I asked what makes a multicultural nation, and my answer is perhaps an obvious one. We make a multicultural nation. Our communities make the multicultural nation. But I really stress the making. I opened with a quote from Sabin Chen and his view of multiculturalism as a process, as it was an articulation of how Chinese Australian communities readily took to and did multiculturalism in the 1970s, whether engaging with the public, with politicians, or with policy. These communities didn't wait for multiculturalism just to happen. Through their actions, they seized the means of societal production and made multiculturalism themselves. Though the means of doing multiculturalism could differ from community to community or organisation to organisation, there was a common underlying ideal to be part of and contribute to Australia. The commitment of Chinese Australian communities to this ideal and others can be traced back through Australian history all the way to the Federation. In the celebrations for the Duke of York's visit and the opening of Australia's Parliament, both German and Chinese communities publicly displayed their ethnic identities and made hopeful gestures for their belonging in the new nation. However, the populations of both ethnic groups shrank in the decades that followed, pointing to perhaps new questions about Australian society before the multicultural turn. After the turn, Chinese Australian communities were willing and able to defend themselves and their multicultural ideals against challenges like those posed by Pauline Hanson's racialised and populist politics. And among other things, these challenges led to greater inter-ethnic dialogue, including reflections about the relationship between the original peoples of these lands and those who settled on them later. But multiculturalism cannot stop at dialogue. Because multiculturalism is a process and multicultural society is comprised of many communities, it's beholden of all communities to take part in doing multiculturalism, including our own scholarly community. Today, there are urgent needs for us to protect and stand with members of our collective community, both here and abroad. As unprecedented as the current disaster in Gaza might seem, Chinese Australian communities in their response to Tiananmen nevertheless give us examples of how we might respond. As the histories of Chinese Australian and other communities have shown, we make a multicultural nation through our actions, by taking part in it, by doing multiculturalism. Let us work together so the process of multiculturalism doesn't end. Thank you.